Hello, everybody. I'm Bryan Easterday, and many of you might be familiar with me from my YouTube channel, Eye of the Storm Astrology, as well as other channels that I've had in the past, or you might have seen me on the One Great Work Network. First off, I want to stop and thank all the organizers of the conference for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to be able to give this presentation, as it's one that is kind of out of my usual, but not too far off of my normal interests. So, and anyone familiar with my work will know that I've been teaching about natural law for a few years now. But another big interest of mine is history. So obviously the founding of the United States, that is quite an interesting time period to be able to study, because the mission of the founding fathers really was to try to form a society that was built or founded on natural law and allowed people to have their rights and to have their liberty. So my intention with this presentation is to ensure I would like to apply a concept here known as the meeting of the minds. Now, this is a concept from contract law, where you're trying to understand the mindset or what the parties involved in the contract were thinking at the time the contract was drafted and agreed to. The Constitution being a compact, which is a contract between sovereign states. It's good to apply this practice to it. And this is something that, you can apply it to all different areas of life, being able to try to understand the mindset of someone else so you can actually have better comprehension of what they're really trying to do. Because if you're going to judge someone or their actions, or, you know, not necessarily in a bad way, but just to observe and, see what were the results of this, understanding the mindset that led to them making those choices, I think is really important. We can't just look at the end of the trivium process. We want to understand how they came to those conclusions. So keep that in mind, for those who might have, bias or previous opinions about the founding fathers, or any of that. I'd ask you to set it aside and really, let's look at what these men were actually trying to accomplish, and some of the things that they said, so we can understand, why they tried to do the things they did. So I want to go ahead and dive into this, because I don't have a whole lot of time and I have a lot of information to cover. So I'm going to try to keep this quick. I'm sorry if it feels like I'm rushing through it. I just really have to keep it into this time limit. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we really want to understand the mindset, we have to understand the context that they were dealing with. So there's a lot that goes into this. So I would encourage everybody to research further. There's no way I could cover, the entirety of this whole subject in such a short presentation. There's a lot of information, but there's some big talking points I would like you to consider. The first one is that they really did have world superpowers who were all wanting power on the new continent. You had the British Empire, the French, the Spanish, there's the Portuguese, the Dutch, to a smaller extent, definitely the big three. And, they were absolutely willing to go to war with each other, or whatever it, was, to be able to have power on the new continent. So if the colonists having been part of the British Empire, well, that was, simple enough, because they had the protection of the empire in that case. But for them to go against that and then to separate from that, that means they also had to then contend with not only that empire, but potentially others. So that was something that they really did have to consider. They weren't America was not a world superpower at the time, far from. Another thing we want to look at is that they had been violated for decades by their own government through, things like the writs of assistance, which included the Stamp Act, and other things that were violating their rights, making them, mandating purchases of certain goods, other things like that. And that this had been happening for a long time. This, through generations, even the American Revolution did not happen overnight. Most revolutions don't. When you study history, you realize that most people really just kind of want to be left alone in their own lives. They don't really feel like dropping everything they're that's going on, and, bringing about something as brutal as warfare. So they tend to put up with abuses until those abuses become so obvious that they just can't be ignored anymore. And that it was no different in the times of the founding fathers. So this was not an overnight revolution. This took a long time. It took a lot of people speaking and sharing information and trying to put that out there to get the people to a point that they were willing to come together and say, no, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And that leads me to the next point, is that they really had the need to organize better than their enemies. And while, the other the first one, doesn't really apply, especially in the US nowadays. We have enough armed Americans that we're not too worried about people invading us or anything. It's not really a realistic thing. That was the case then. But what we do have in common is that we do have the need to organize better than our enemies. If you have enemies that are very well organized and they are determined to take your liberty away, the only option you have is to become better organized than them. So that's something that we can relate to in our modern context, as well as the context of the founding fathers here. Another big thing that they had to look at is that they needed to establish and participate trade in order to build their economy. That was a very real concern. It's revolution and rebellion. It's not just about making that happen. Well, one, how are you going to fund that? How are you going to get supplies during that? And then even after that, how are you going to establish, how are you going to organize society? How are you going to do all these things? They had to be able to establish trade with other countries and those type of things in order so they can import the things they needed, export other things, and have that economy. So that was something that it was an issue, it was a problem that they had to figure out how to deal with. They didn't have quite the, they weren't as blessed, with the amazing tools that we have, such as technology and other things like that. Trade and things back then was a much more complex thing, in the sense that it took a lot of planning and a lot of organization. So that was also something that, you have to understand, that in their context, that was something they also had to try to figure out, which is, things like that are a big reason why it takes so long for some people to get to the point of actually standing up and rebelling, is because a lot of those other things kind of have to be, figured out, where they get to the point that they're so terrible anyway that they're kind of just put to the wayside, because people have to figure out, these other problems. So I think it's just important to look at a few of those points, and then, yourself, again, go look deeper at, what was the context, what was different for them than what is for us, and what was similar, what can we learn from observing and comparing those two. The next thing I want to look at is the founder's intention. What does it say on the Declaration of Independence? Well, I think the best way to figure that out is obviously to read it. So let me pull that up here. Okay, so let's read it. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read the first little bit, because it really does a great job of summarizing, kind of in a holistic way, not only what the founding fathers, what their beliefs were, but what their intentions were, and their motivations for doing what they did. So I'll kind of read through it, and then we'll go back through and break some parts down, and we'll do that in a couple different segments here. So the first one: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. So we'll stop real quick. First thing I want to highlight: when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected with them another. They were very aware that throughout history, mankind changes, people's opinions change. Certain groups that may have been very close at one point may become very distant at others. That's just the nature of life, and they understood that. They also understood here that they were allowed to then remove themselves. They have the right of association. In other words, that's here, even though it's not stated, hey, we have the right of association. That's what they're talking. That's what's here. When you have they're saying you have the right to organize and associate with who you want. And then if you need to remove yourself into a separate group, you can do that. Why can you do that? Because, and it's a separate and an equal station. You have just as much rights as the other group does. You can do that because the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them. So we're talking about natural law here. And then they go on to say, well, we're going to explain why we're doing this. First, we hold these truths to be self-evident. So that's the first reason. They're holding these truths to be self-evident, so anyone with eyes can see that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So we'll cruise through this and highlight some very important things. Obviously we hold these truths to be self-evident. I think that's a great way to lead with it, because it's pointing out that this is natural law. It's everywhere. It's universal. It's a self-evident truth if you just observe. Well, what are these truths? That one, all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Many people pronounce that unalienable, but if you kind of slow it down a little bit, unalienable. What does that mean? You can't put a lien against it. They can't turn that right into a privilege. It's not something that can be sold off. There's no lien that can be put against it. So it's a right it's inherent. I think that's a very important thing that a lot of people look over there. What are some of these rights? That among, not all of them, but among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And life, pretty obvious. Liberty, we're going to talk about a little more in depth on the next slide. And the pursuit of happiness, it doesn't mean just go around doing whatever you want. Pursuit of happiness actually includes a lot of things about property rights, and they use that phrase very specifically for a reason. But I don't have a lot of time to get into that one just now. But understand that it means something more than just trying to be a happy person. That's not what they're meaning with this. And then after that, that to secure these rights, to secure the rights, it doesn't mean to create them. It doesn't mean to give them to you, to secure them. So you inherently have them. This is to secure them. What is it? That governments are instituted among men, not above men, among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Well, just means, if you look at the Latin etymology, essentially it's going to mean right. So the right power that they can have come from the consent of the governed. In other words, they're not exercising a form of power that didn't come from a voluntary means. It didn't come from consent. It's not something that one person has the right to do and another person doesn't. It's not that at all. So we have to understand that the intention of these men was to establish a just government, and that is very distinct from what we normally think of when we think of government. And I'm not talking, this presentation isn't about what happened to it, how did it work, what we're dealing with now. I'm trying to look at, again, we're trying to understand the context and the mindset of these men to understand why they did what they did. And then they go on that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, of what ends? Well, securing your rights. So if they're violating your rights, they're becoming destructive of those ends. And then what happens? It is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So again, they understand, they weren't laying down a document saying, oh, this is what's supposed to be for all time. They understood that people and times change. and that people, no matter what time period in history they are, if they find that a government is being unjust, it's not securing their rights, it's violating their rights, it's doing the exact opposite of what it's supposed to, then they have the right to alter or abolish it and to then form through through voluntary association, through consent, whatever form of social organization they want, whatever form of government that they want. Very clear what these men are talking about. They're talking about natural law. They understand their rights come from the creator. They understand that they're inherent, that the rights aren't coming from the government. Just so for people who make the claim that, oh, the rights come from the Constitution, the founding fathers never once said that. In fact, they said the exact opposite over and over again, including in the introduction of the document itself. So I think we need to actually understand what these men were really trying to do. And it was to establish a society based on natural law, or establish a just government, a right government, which is one that was done through voluntary means and through consent. So let's look at, a very important word here. And it's, what is, liberty? What is it? Well, liberty, in short, just to get to the point, it's the intersection between freedom and morality. In freedom, you can go, you're doing whatever you want. Liberty requires morality as well. So you're exercising your freedom so long as you're not violating the rights or the freedoms of other people. So it's a moral freedom. That's liberty. You can note that it has the same root word as library etymologically, which is liber, meaning book or knowledge. Well, that's because for liberty to happen, you have to have knowledge of natural law, of morality. If you don't know right and wrong, how do you know you're not violating someone's rights? If you don't even know your rights, how do you know your rights aren't being violated? It really works both ways. So you have to have that knowledge in order to create that state of liberty. That's why Patrick Henry said, give me liberty or give me death. It wasn't give me freedom or give me death. This is liberty. The founding fathers, they wrote about this over and over again, that liberty was something that this is what they were seeking out. They wanted a moral society that understood natural law, and that people got to exercise their rights, and their liberty only ended where another person's began, just like that other person's ended where theirs began. It was supposed to be an equal and where everybody's equally respected in society. And I think that's a very great thing to strive for. So what are some things that our founding fathers had to say on the subjects of liberty and natural law? Samuel Adams once said, no people will tamely surrender their liberties, nor can they be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved. On the contrary, when people are universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, they will sink under their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. So what can we see here? That liberty, and knowledge, morality, these all go hand in hand, because if he said, no people can be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved. So it's knowledge and virtue, knowledge and morality. So it's natural law, the understanding of natural law, which is what will give people liberty, and they won't tamely surrender them, or will they be easily subdued if they have that. But on the other hand, when they're universally ignorant, they don't want knowledge, and they're debauched in their manners, they're immoral, they will sink under the weight or sink under their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. You don't even need someone else to invade you. You'll destroy yourself if you're ignorant and immoral. I think that's quite a strong statement, that it is absolutely true. What else did some of the other founders have to say? Well, Thomas Jefferson said, educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They're the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Short quote, but there's a lot in there. You have to educate and inform the whole mass of the people. It can't just be a small group that has this knowledge. It needs to be as many people as you can possibly get. And that's the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. Why is that? Because if you have a bunch of ignorant people, just like in the previous quote, Samuel Adams spoke about, what's that going to do? It's going to destroy society. They're not going to preserve their liberty if they don't know what it is. And it's, I think he says here, it's, the preservation of our liberty. There is an understanding that, it's not, once you have it, it's not, you don't just have it forever. It has to be preserved. I think that's a very interesting point to look at as well. Samuel Adams again, the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth and not to be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature as his rule. So we see again a connection between liberty and natural law, that it's an inherent in nature. That it's an alignment with nature. If we really actually look at it, we can create a state of liberty where we have a society of people who are both, knowledgeable and moral. Because for liberty exist, it doesn't just, like I said, it doesn't just require knowledge, it's that morality and then actually choosing that right action. If you have that knowledge and you choose immoral things, that doesn't create a state of liberty, does it? Right? It immediately destroys that liberty, because the only way a state of liberty can be there is if people are actually choosing that right action. That's something very interesting to look at. And that, it's the law of nature which allows us to have the most liberty. That's really the only restraint that we should have. It is natural law, and that's if you want to look at it as a restraint. I don't see it that way at all. Alexander Hamilton said, God has constituted an eternal and immutable law which is indispensably obligatory upon all mankind prior to any human institution whatever. This is what is called the law of nature. Upon this law depend the natural rights of mankind. The sacred lights of mankind are written, as with the sunbeam, in the whole volume of human nature, by the hand of divinity itself, and can never be erased or obscured by moral power. And then he goes on. No tribunal, no codes, no systems can repeal or impair this law of God. By his eternal law, it is evident in all things. So again, see him speaking about a natural law. It's eternal and immutable. It applies to everybody. It's a universal law, that it's the creator that has put that it's observable. You can see it throughout all human nature. So we obviously see a very common theme through these different founders, that they had a deep understanding of natural law and where their rights actually came from, and that they definitely did not believe their rights came from government at all, for themselves or for anyone else. This is a quote from Cicero, and Cicero obviously is not a founding father. I think it's very important, if you want to understand the mindset of the founding fathers, not only to read what they wrote, but to go read what they read as well. Then you'll really come to an understanding of why they wrote and said the things that they did. So Cicero said, there is in fact a true law, namely right reason, which is in accordance with nature, applies to all men, and is unchangeable and eternal. To invalidate this law by human legislation is never morally right, nor is it permissible ever to restrict its operation, and to annul it wholly impossible. It will not lay down one law at Rome and another at Athens, nor will it be one rule today and another tomorrow. But there will be one law, eternal and unchangeable, binding at all times upon all peoples, and there will be, as it were, one common master and ruler of men, namely God, who is the author of this law, its interpreter, and its sponsor. Again, very common themes here. It's this law that it's eternal and unchangeable. You can't invalidate it. To try to do so is always going to be immoral. It's binding upon all peoples. It doesn't just change. I love that he puts, it will not lay down one law at Rome and another Athens, nor will it be one rule today and another tomorrow. Look how ridiculous some of the laws and the ideas in society have, that, oh, you cross this imaginary line and it changes. That's ridiculous. That's moral relativism. This is an eternal law. It's always there, and it's obvious in nature. And you can think of, God as whether you want to think of God from a Christian perspective, or, I think of God from a much more animist or pagan perspective, as like source, Bhagavan, Vishnu, however you want to look at it. You can See that that is what puts this law into place. That's what's in control of this, and not in like a very judgmental way. Just look at nature and you can observe these things. You can see how they play out. That's what Cicero is referring to here. Samuel Adams, again, on the natural rights of man. Among the natural rights of the colonist are these: first, a right to life; secondly, to liberty; thirdly, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. These are evident branches of, rather than deductions from, the duty of self preservation, commonly called the first law of nature. All positive and civil laws should conform as far as possible to the law of natural reason and equity. So, very clear here. He says, something very similar as to what we see in the Declaration of Independence that we just covered. I also love that he had, added in, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. That doesn't mean you can only use this one thing, or this one type of gun, or this, that's why they put in the Second Amendment, it's the right to bear arms. It's not the right to bear guns. It's the right to bear arms, like any weapon you need to be able to support and defend your property. So long as you're not using that to go out and then violate the rights and the liberties of others, you should be allowed to have that. It's your inherent right to do that. And then he breaks in the evident, these are evident branches of, rather than deductions from, the duty of self-preservation, commonly called the first law of nature. Look in nature and observe. What is every creature, every being, whether it's a man or an animal or whatever it is, what does it have an inherent right to do? It has a right to feed itself, to find water, to shelter itself, to defend itself when attacked. Those are all things that it's obvious. You can see it. It's right there. Like I said, these we hold these truths to be self-evident. They said that for these specific reasons, that we have a right to self-preservation. We have a right to have our life and our property without being harassed. And if we are harassed, we have the right to defend ourselves and to defend that property. So these next couple slides, I'm going to ask a question that might seem completely impossible for it to be true at all, but I would ask you to take a minute and to stop and think and look at some things from maybe a slightly different perspective you haven't considered before, because this was a realization I kind of had to come to myself within the last year, and it took me a little bit to process it. But it's the fact that, you know natural law, anarchy, and government, I'm asking, can they exist together? And I'll go ahead and say I think they can, in a very specific context, and nuance has to be applied. But let's look at some things here really quick and see if they're just mutually exclusive, just by looking at their definitions. So first off, with anarchy, if we look at the etymology, obviously, I probably don't need to tell anyone here at this conference what it means: no rulers, no masters. But what does that mean? It also means that it does not mean no representatives. A representative is very different than a ruler or a master. That's a person with a job to do, right? They're a representative. That doesn't mean they completely control your whole life. They're not a king. They're not a king. They're not a master. They're not a ruler. It's a totally different thing. So, anarchy simply means no masters. So keep in mind that doesn't exclude representatives. Then if you look at government, it comes from the Latin verb gubernare, which means to control, and the Latin noun mens, meaning mind. So we could, many people, will see that as mind control. Okay, well, let's stop and think. Is mind control always bad? May sound shocking at first, but the key is to ask yourself, well, what mind is being controlled? Is the control being exercised over another's mind, or is the control being exercised over your own? See, one is not okay. One is a good thing. We need to have self control. That's why the founding fathers wrote about self government all the time. What does that mean? Self control. Individuals who understand liberty and respect not only will want to preserve theirs, but preserve that of others as well. So when you think about people being able to then organize together to have they have self-control, and then they're organized together through voluntary means in order to achieve tasks that they all have the right to do with, commerce, defend themselves, organize for whatever projects they need to amongst themselves, those type of things. They have the right to do that as individuals, which means they have the right to organize together to achieve those things, so long as that control is not being forced on other people. The key is that it's voluntary and it's consensual. If it is in that specific context, anarchy and government aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. And again, I know that that may sound like a lot immediately, but think about it. It's, and again, I know governments may go way, almost always go way out of control. Those type of things. That's not what I'm speaking about here. I'm just speaking about it in theory and looking at what the founding fathers actually tried to do. This is why they could come to the conclusions that they did. It was not about the control, or exercising control over others. They very much were talking about a government of self-control, self-government done through voluntary consensual means. That's very, very different than how we see most governments play out. And I do think, there's obviously, I don't think anything wrong with that, so long as everything is voluntary, right? So let's look at, a few things here. A big argument that I've seen in the anarchist community, and that I've used myself many times when talking with people trying to teach them about anarchy, and it's bringing up the point that you can't delegate away a right you don't have. But on the flip side, if you continue that thought pattern, what does that also mean? You can delegate away a right that you do have. And I'll give an example. I can't take my neighbor's car and say, hey, you're allowed to go drive that around and do whatever you want with it. I don't have that right. But what can I do? Well, I have my vehicle and I'm allowed to share that with whoever I like. I can delegate away the right to use that property because it's mine. So that there's two sides to that coin there. And I think we need to look at both of them. So human beings always need to have some sort of system of organization in order to resolve issues or for just the basic functioning of society. You have to be able to organize together so people can bring together different ideas. They can, hopefully through peaceful, voluntary means, be able to come up with solutions to problems and then to be able to act together to achieve those goals. There has to be some sort of system of organization. Does it need to be a mass system that everybody's under this one thing? No, absolutely not. Personally, I think many small individual little systems work much better, local type of systems, but that's just my personal opinion. But the key is these systems have to be voluntary. And if these systems are based on us delegating away rights that we do have, to trade, to defend ourselves, to, work on organizing for, building infrastructure, for the benefit of society, those type of things, we're all allowed to do that as individuals, which means we're allowed to organize together to achieve those goals. And when you think about it, it's a very obvious thing, but, you know, I think many, including myself, for many years, didn't think those two things could actually exist together. And I have to say I've come to a different conclusion as time has went on. So when we are developing these systems, I think there's something that's important to note, and it's that change is constant. So we have to develop systems that are both constant and can change and flux with the times as needed by the people to ensure their liberty. The constant that we need to have the system built on, the foundation, is always going to be natural law. It's always going to be liberty, having that freedom where it comes together with morality. So people, they're educated and they're moral and they're choosing that right action. But we also need to be able to have like the actual system, the mechanics of the system itself, be able to change and flex with the times. So yeah, we might choose to organize and solve this problem by coming together and having a 2/3 vote now. Well, maybe in the future for a different generation, That's not the most effective way to get it done. Maybe they choose a different voluntary means of doing that. That's perfectly okay. The key is that the foundation, the solid foundation that's eternal, which is natural law, is there. And then how different people choose to come up to resolve their issues is all up to them as individuals or groups who are voluntarily organizing together. So I do think all of these things can coexist when done in the proper context. So what did Thomas Jefferson say about the way we should design our system and those type of things? He said, I'm not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still a coat which fitted him when a boy, as a civilized society to remain under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. So I think that can completely destroy the notion that these men were trying to establish something that then everybody had to be stuck under for the rest of time. No, that's just not at all what they did. They understood that a system had to be able to change and why we should try to have it constant and not just change it at every whim. We should look and see that as society and as things come up that change really is required, we need to be able to have a system which can do that in order to best serve the people. Trying to make what was working 300 years ago work now and not giving anybody the option to try anything different, like as he put it, it's like you might as well require a man to wear still a coat which fitted him as a boy. And then he says to then as a civilized society to remain under the regimen of the barbarous ancestor. These men very much had the mindset that when they really thought that if human beings were given the chance to have their liberty, that they would advance, that they would grow, that they would become more moral, and that eventually even the founding fathers themselves would seem like their barbarous ancestors, and that we should have hopefully evolved to have a better understanding of liberty even than them. That was their hope. That's what they were really thinking was going to happen. So they understood that, what they were doing right then very much, very likely would need changed sometime down the road. And they made sure to ensure that the system that they were trying to design had the ability to do that and to be able to do it and resolve those issues in a peaceful way. So we didn't just have to go through bloody revolution after bloody revolution to make those things happen. So let's look at, where does authority come from? Because a lot of people say, this authority doesn't exist, or, whatever it is. There's a lot of different things people say about it. Now, legally, there is a way that authority actually flows, like legitimately. Then there's a way that we're taught. The way that we're taught is that it's the federal government. They're the most powerful. They're on top. They have the final say in things. Then we're taught below them is the state, then the local, and then the last little peon people at the bottom are the people. That is not how it is actually supposed to work. When we actually look at it, authority comes from the creator, source, God, whatever you want to call it, created us. Then we're mankind. Then we have natural rights. We have inherent rights because we're just like any other being on this planet. Then people have the right to voluntarily organize. So they do so to form states. What you have to understand about our states here in the US is that each state is like a sovereign country in and of itself. The state of Kansas, it has the same sovereignty as the state of Germany, the state of England, the state of France. That's what that means. And then we have a United States of America, which forms the federal government. So the people form the states, and then the states form the feds. Now, there's a maxim in law that you have to understand, which is that the created cannot control the creator, right? Like if you're, and a good example of this, like if you have a child, right? As a parent, you have the right to kind of you're kind of the boss of that child up until they're no longer minor and they can take their own sovereignty. The same thing here. So when we really understand that the states actually were formed before the federal government, because they can't form a federal government if they don't exist first, right? So you have the states, and then the states create the feds. The federal government is below the states. So if this individual state wants to tell the federal government to go fuck itself, in short, it absolutely has the right and the authority to do that. Where does it get that authority? Well, because the states were formed by the people, and the people have the authority to do that, because the only way the states, which in turn the federal government came into existence, is because the people had the right to organize together to get delegate away rights that they do have in order to accomplish something. They created a contract, and the federal government got its power from that contract. Well, anything outside of that contract is a breach of the contract, so the power then becomes null and void. So we have to understand that the power comes from us, and then that, where do we get it? It comes from the creator. It comes from source, because we're a manifestation of that source. We're a fractal of that source. We're source here having an experience of itself. So we have the power to do that. We're on top. The federal government is the lowest. And we really have to shift our mindset and educate people on that, because that makes a huge difference in the way that you're looking at how things operate. And it lets you see just how upside down things are now. So to reiterate again, where do our rights come from? Well, our rights come from the creator of nature. I have an image of Bhagavan here, of Vishnu. Personally, as a pagan, as a Vedic astrologer, I think Bhagavan or Vishnu is one of the best ways to understand source of the creation. But you can put whatever image there that you feel like, even if you're a person that just believes just in nature itself, whatever it is, your rights inherently come from there. But then they're guaranteed by the constitutions. So your rights come from a creator, and they're guaranteed by the constitutions. They're not, they don't come from the Constitution. The Constitution is just a contract that's guaranteeing that. But who has to actually hold that contract up? We do. So that means our rights are protected and exercised by us. So ultimately, the creator can give them to us. A constitution can guarantee it. But if we don't understand, exercise, and protect our rights ourselves, it doesn't matter. So it's ultimately up to us. So that again shows you the power is always with us. And it's up for us to remember that we have that responsibility to be able to exercise that power. An important thing to look at here is that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, all of these documents that were drafted, this was not the first time this was done. So in English law, there was a long history of English freedom charters. There's the 1100 Charter of Liberties, the Magna Carta in 1215, the Petition of Right, 1628, the Grand Remonstrance, the English Bill of Rights. Each of these went through and established different rights, like the right to religion, the right to press, association, to bear arms, so on and so forth. What the founding fathers did is they took all of these different rights and these different freedom charters, and then they brought it all together in the Constitution. This is why we're still under like an English common law. So what that means, though, is a lot of people think of they rebelled against the king and everything like that. But what they don't realize is that it was actually a lawful rebellion, that it was actually based off of contracts, previous agreements that had been made throughout English history that guaranteed people certain rights. And whenever those were being violated, it meant they had the right to rise up, to be able to fight the king, assail them by any means possible until they got their grievances redressed. It's actually in the clause 61 of the Magna Carta where that was established. And I'll cover that on the next slide here. So I think that's a very interesting thing to study, that, they say our Constitution is a very unique thing in history, and to some extent it was, but it was also based off of a long history of freedom charters and different experiments and people trying to protect their rights. And the founding fathers, the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, these were just the newest attempts to try to bring all of this together and solidify it into a society where liberty was actually preserved. So Clause 61 of the Magna Carta is very interesting because it did a few things, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's very long, but a few important points. First off, it established 25 barons, which eventually became Parliament, the basis for Parliament. These barons, their job was to kind of be an in between the people and the king. That if the people had any grievances, they could bring up the grievance to at least four barons, and then those barons would bring it to others, and then they would present it to the king. The king would then have within 40 days to address to fix that grievance, and if not, the people and the barons included were all allowed to assail the king by any means necessary until they got those grievances met, and they were made whole again. It's a legal terminology. If you look into that, to be made whole, it means everything to be made right again. So it established the right of the people to assail the king, to assail the government by any means necessary if the government didn't keep to its promises, to its contract, if they were going outside the bounds of the agreement. That's a very important point. So whenever we look at the founding fathers and we see they had this understanding, they had this knowledge, so they knew what they were doing was not only a rebellion, but it was lawful. They had a legal argument for it. And when you look at, well, why would they care about documents written hundreds of years ago? In legal understanding, the older something is and where it hasn't been revoked or overturned, the more strength it has, the more of a solid foundation it has, because it's been in play for so long, or it's been active so long. So the Magna Carta being something that since 1215 has been in effect, and still to this day, the basis of a lot of law, especially in English common law countries, you can trace back to the Magna Carta. It's a very interesting document to find. And in fact, you can get a copy of it and the other British freedom charters for maybe $4 or $5 on Amazon. It's very easy to get a hold of and read. You can find free PDFs as well. But I think that's an interesting point, because what it does is when you see that people could have a lawful rebellion, it makes it to where people, they're not stuck with the choice between choosing between their morality and legality, right? And not that people should think that their moral should be based off of what the law is, but a law should be a moral law in the first place, because when they're aligned, people aren't left in that position where they feel like, oh, I have to do what's morally right, but I have to also, it's also illegal and I have to risk jail and so on and so forth. If it's a lawful thing for them to do, then it's people will come up and they'll rebel. They will exercise that right much quicker if they understand that they have it. So I think that's an important thing to look at. A good quote that would go along with this would be from Frederick Bastiat in his work that he did, The Law, where he said the best way to make people respect laws is to make them respectable. In other words, make the law a moral thing, make it something that aligns with people's rights, and then it's very easy for them to respect that and then not have to be forced to break it. So the founding fathers actually did have a lawful rebellion, and I think that's a very interesting distinction to look at. So something else I want to look at here is, did the Constitution fail? This is something I hear a lot. Oh, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. It failed. It didn't do anything, so on and so forth. Well, let's see if that's actually true. Let's ask ourselves some questions. First off, to see if the Constitution failed, we have to understand, what is it? Well, what is it? It's a compact. What is a compact? Compact is a contract between sovereign states. So if France and Germany decide to make a contract together, that contract is actually what's known as a compact. Same thing, it's just a contract between sovereign states. So who are the parties to the compact? Well, it's the states. Who created the states? The people did. So then who ultimately is responsible for the contract being upheld? It means we are responsible. So you can't say the Constitution failed. If you have two parties involved in a contract and then neither party upholds the contract, did that piece of paper itself fail, or was it the parties involved who didn't keep to to doing what they said they were going to. The parties involved failed, not the contract itself. So the Constitution didn't fail. We, as the people, definitely did. And then those, who go into government and then constantly violates, they're equally as responsible because they're also part of the people. But we're the ones that are responsible. So we need to stop saying that, oh, that failed or whatever it is. And we need to point the finger back at ourselves and see where is our responsibility for allowing our rights to be violated, regardless of what any piece of paper says. Because whether that's there or not, you're still in this day and age, right now, in this moment, responsible for whether or not you're allowing yourself to be violated. So are you failing? Maybe ask ourselves that instead of asking whether or not the Constitution failed or assuming that it did. I think another interesting point here is on the inheritance of liberty. You think of it here, just because a child may squander away the inheritance given to them, it does not mean that inheritance wasn't there. It must be maintained in order so as to be passed on to the next generation. So again, like I said, if someone got an inheritance and they had a house and they had money and then they went and spent it all and then they just didn't maintain the house and they destroyed it, does that mean that inheritance wasn't given to them in the first place? No, it just means they squandered it. Well, liberty is just like any inheritance. It's up to each generation to be able to take that and to pass it on, hopefully to strengthen it, to grow that wealth along the way, just like any other inheritance. But just because one generation establishes a free society where liberty is intact, that doesn't mean it's going to be there for all time. It's up to each following generation after that to maintain that for themselves. And if you are born into a time where you don't have that liberty, it's up to you to establish it and then hopefully teach the future generations enough of the value of it that they also want to maintain that state of liberty. So let's look at some of the rights that are so important the founding fathers really spoke about a lot here. And I'm going to have to go through these pretty quickly because I'm kind of running short on time here. So Benjamin Franklin on the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is the principal pillar of a free government. When the support is taken away, the constitution of a free society is dissolved and tyranny is erected in its ruins. We can absolutely see how that's playing out today. Why is free speech a principal pillar of a free government? Because it's in a free society, you have to be able to own your speech. You have to be able to share ideas freely. And if you can't do that, then how can you actually exercise your liberty? How can you own your own thoughts, own yourself, have the full property of yourself if someone's controlling that most basic right? It's an essential part of being able to have a society based on liberty. George Washington said, if freedom of speech is taken away, then dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. Absolutely true. Because if you can't speak, you're silent. And if you can't educate yourself, you can't share ideas, you're going to be dumb. And then you will be led to the slaughter. James Madison on the purpose of government. Government is instituted to protect property of every sort, as well as that which lies in the various rights of individuals, and that which the term particularly expresses. This being the end of government, that alone is a just government which impartially secures for each man whatever is own. So the only purpose of government is, again, to help secure your rights, your property. If it's doing anything outside of that, it's not what it's supposed to be doing. Justice William Blackstone was an English justice who actually wrote things that actually inspired the founding fathers to have a lot of the knowledge that they did, and then to be able to share that and spread it around. And in one of his writings, he named the elements of property ownership, and there were 5 elements to it that he laid out, and I thought these are very interesting to understand here. The first off is that you have to have the free use of, the enjoyment, and the disposal of all his acquisitions without any control or diminution except by the laws of consent. So in order for you to be free, to have your property, to have all your liberty, you have to have the free use, the enjoyment, and the disposal of all your acquisitions. So you're allowed to do whatever you want with all of your property without any control or diminution. So what's diminution? Taxes, right? If they're they're making your property smaller and smaller, especially if they're doing that without consent. That means you don't own your property, right? Someone's stealing from you. Your liberty is being violated. So if someone can't control it, your vehicle, right? What do? They charge you taxes on it. They try to control it. Those type of things, they're violating your property rights. And the last little bit is except by the laws of consent. So again, if it's voluntary, if I agree to pay this tax, then that's perfectly okay. It's a voluntary contract I agreed to. That's a totally different situation. But if it's being done by force and without your consent, then it's nothing more than threat, and they're violating your property rights. So I definitely encourage people more to look up Justice William Blackstone. I really wish I had more time to spend on it. He wrote some very interesting things, so I definitely encourage people to look at his work. George Washington said, "Freedom and property rights are inseparable. You can't have one without the other." Why is that? Well, you have to own your property, but you also have to understand the founding fathers' understanding of property is probably much deeper than ours. Your thoughts are your property. Your speech is your property. Your beliefs, all of these. So if you don't have free access of all those, you can't actually have a state where freedom is there, where you have your liberty. They're inseparable. So you have to have your property rights intact. Samuel Adams said, "Now what liberty can there be where property is taken away without consent?" Why is that? Why couldn't there be liberty if something's taken away without consent? Because liberty is a state where you are exercising your rights so long as you're not what? Violating the rights of others. The moment you do that, that's not liberty anymore. So as soon as something is being done without consent and the rights are being violated, it's no longer a state of liberty. So people, if their property is being stolen, they can't have a state of liberty while that's going on. Let's look at religion here. James Madison said, "The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it's the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate." In other words, every individual is responsible for their own conscience, their own morality. It's not up for the government to decide what's right for people. John Leland at the Virginia Baptist General Convention said, "The notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. Government should protect every man in thinking and speaking freely, and to see that one does not abuse another. The liberty I contend for is more than toleration, and the very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians." So this was a Christian Baptist pastor who's himself is saying the notion of a Christian commonwealth should be exploded forever. So when people are saying the United States is a Christian nation or Christianity goes hand in hand, that's just not true. And that's, look at what the founder said. It was about protecting everybody's rights. This gentleman said the very idea of toleration is despicable because it supposes some have preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence. That's not, he's saying everyone has equal rights regardless of their religious belief. That's the kind of understanding we need to have, and we need to be actually willing to stand up for the rights of people, even if they believe something completely different than us. So George Washington on the right to bear arms, he said, "When the government takes away a citizen's right to bear arms, it becomes a citizen's duty to take away the government's right to govern." What can we see in this? Well, obviously, if the citizens can take away the government's right to govern, it means that they gave them that power in the first place. So ultimately, the power lies in the people. As soon as the government violates their contract, they lose whatever authority they have. It becomes immediately null and void, and the people have the right to take away their right to govern because they're the ones that gave it to them in the first place. James Madison said, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-regulated militia, composed of the body of the people, trained in arms, is the best and most natural defense for a free country." So he's not talking about the National Guard here. He's saying very clearly A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained in arms, is the best and most natural defense for a free country. They did not want standing armies. If I had time, I would absolutely get into their quotes on standing armies. They were absolutely against them. They wanted to have well-trained militia so people at any time, anywhere could rise up to defend their own rights anytime they needed to. That was the intention. That was what the founders had in mind. And the First Amendment is your first line of defense against tyranny. The second one is what you use when that first doesn't work. That's why they designed it that way. So that leads me to the point that our resolve must be unshakable. We have to understand some things, and that it's not just about standing up for your rights. It's about standing up for everyone's. So it's not just you as an individual, it's everyone's rights that we need to be concerned with. And it's not just about standing up for the rights you like, it's about standing up for all of them all the time. So, it's not just about, oh, I like my Second Amendment. Oh, I like to have my right to abortion. Oh, I like to have my right to free speech. You need to stand up for all of them all the time. And only when we have a society of individuals willing to lay down their lives to defend their neighbors' rights will we have a society that preserves our liberty. Standing up for your rights is one thing, but being willing to go lay down your life to help defend your neighbor's rights from being violated, that's when you really have a society of people where that tyranny is not going to exist there, because those people are not going to allow it to, and they're willing to sacrifice anything they have to not only ensure their rights and their liberties protected, but the other people in their society as well. That's the level of resolve that we need to get to if we actually want to have a society that is truly allows us to have our liberty. Is this the hill you're willing to die on? So this is a question that is asked usually in a military context. In the military, if you're looking at a hill, uh, you look at it and see if whether or not is this enough. Is this hill does it have enough strategic importance that I'm willing to die on it? Because that's a legitimate question you should ask yourself. It is a good question to ask, but it also, I kind of thought of it again because I had an interaction. I'll tell a very short story here. I had an interaction with a sheriff not too long ago, and we had gotten to a discussion about the Constitution and rights and things, and he was actually also more of a constitutionalist type of person. So we were having a good discussion, but he had brought up something. He said, well, you have to ask yourself, like, is this the hill you want to die on? Because we're talking about whether or not you have to have a driver's license, that type of thing. And he was, I could tell he's a former military guy as well. So he just asked that standard question, and why it does make sense to think. I also think we have to realize something. And I want you to imagine some imagery here. I want you to imagine a battlefield with some hills on it. And then imagine that every right is a hill on the battlefield between liberty and slavery. And to give up any of them is to give the enemy a high ground and therefore the advantage. Never give up your high ground. And remember, the reason that you have that ground in the first place is because you are a manifestation of the highest power. So if you imagine a battlefield, and you imagine, like I said, each one of those hills is right. So there's the hill, you have free speech over there and the right to bear arms over there. Well, if you're saying, oh, I'm not willing to die on that hill, I'm not going to defend that right, what did you just do? Well, you just allowed the enemy to have the high ground there, to have the position which gives them a military and a strategic advantage. Well, once they have that, it's easier for them to go after other hills. Or if they've proven, hey, that they won't fight for this hill, they won't die on this hill, why would they die on another? You always want to hold all of the high ground on a battlefield. And you understand, because you're a manifestation of source, you're a fractal of that infinite consciousness. That's why you have that high ground initially. They're below you. Those servants, the government, those are non-entities. They're not living entities. They are below you. You have to realize that, and don't ever, ever let them put themselves above you, because as soon as they do that, you have put yourself at a disadvantage because you've allowed that to happen. So what are some things we can learn from the founders? Well, there's a lot we can learn. No way I could list it all on a slide, but in short, we could learn that that they were right in very much of what they said about life, liberty, property, and much more. So I encourage you to go read their work, and I'll list some resources here in the next slide for you guys to be able to check out. But read what they wrote, and also read the people that they read. Like, I mentioned Cicero earlier, and others, Marcus Aurelius, other great thinkers that they studied, because you're going to see why they came to a lot of the conclusions that they did. Another thing I think that we can learn is that even when good men build a society of liberty, that it's up to each generation to then build upon and strengthen that foundation of liberty. That one generation of people can't create liberty for people for all time. It's up to all of us all the time to ensure that we have it. And I think that's a very important lesson we can learn looking back on what these men did, and to see how it played out. So where do we go from here? Well, just like a vehicle or house, constitutions can fall into disrepair if not maintained or problems not corrected. So you think about, like, in the exact same way, like when you have like a vehicle or a house who it's fallen to disrepair, you have two options, right? You can either repair or restore it to the optimal condition, which, so you have to do maintenance on it. And that's what's going to help it run in the first place, is being able to maintain it. But they're, say someone, they drive their car and they never give it an oil change. They never check the tire pressure. They never change the spark. They don't do any of the maintenance they're supposed to have. Of course, after a while, that car is going to run like shit and it's going to break down. Does that mean that car was inherently flawed, or was it the operator that was flawed? Again, where's our responsibility? Where's our culpability? So we could either restore it, or if we deem it beyond repair, we can build a new one. But that doesn't mean we wouldn't use the same principles applied in the building of an old one. So, for example, like with the car, you're still going to need fuel and air and spark. You're still going to need a transmission. You're going to need tires. You're going to, so the just because a car wears out or gets older, breaks down, it doesn't mean that design itself is inherently flawed. And you wouldn't use those same principles again. Same thing in a house. The same way I need electricity to run the house, and then you run it through lines, and it has to go to a breaker box, and you have to have fuses, and then it goes to outlets, and then so the same type of knowledge applies no matter which house you're building. So no matter which voluntary system you're building, you need to have there's going to be some principles that are always there. Those principles that need to always be there are the principles of natural law, of people who actually understand liberty, that they have the knowledge of morality, and that they're choosing that right action in order so that they can exercise their liberty, but also to ensure that they're helping protect others, one, by not violating it themselves. So I think we have to look at this. This is where we're at. We can look at the past, and we can learn from the founders. What did they do right? What worked? What didn't work? Maybe what design, where do we need to change the design? Where do we need to modify something? Or, oh, here was a failure point. Just like in a car, right? There might be a part that has a failure point. Maybe that part needs redesigned, and that helps the whole engine run better. We have to look at our different options and then see where we go from there. And I'm not, by any means saying, any one individual or anything like that should decide that. But I think these are questions that we all need to ask ourselves, so we can kind of have an idea of what type of goals we need to set for ourselves in order to achieve something. If you're just going through something without a mission, without a purpose, without an intention, and you're not clear on the result that you're seeking, you're never actually going to get what you want. You have to get clear on what you are trying to manifest. So if we want to manifest a society where we have more liberty and more of our rights inherently intact and protected, we need to get very clear on how we want to go about achieving that. And to do that, I think this is a great question to ask ourselves. So some resources for further research. First off, I want to recommend libertyfirstsociety.com, and I'm going to go through these really quick just to wrap it up. Probably one of the best courses that I found on the Constitution, the history of the Constitution, how the government's actually supposed to work, and those type of things. If it's just like you said, if you have a car and it's broke down, but you don't understand how it works, how can you fix it? You can't, or you may not even know something's wrong if you don't understand how it works, right? So you first have to have that knowledge, because awareness reveals choice. So learn how it actually works, and then you can start to see, well, where's it broken? How do we resolve it? Those type of things. So this is a great resource for that. Liberty First Society. Stop by Chris Ann Hall and her husband. She's a former prosecutor for the state of Florida, and now is an attorney that helps. She's a constitutional attorney that goes around and helps people fight cases whenever their rights are being violated. She's done like a lot of First Amendment cases and things like that. Really very knowledgeable woman, and I think she's an excellent educator as well. Also, read the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers. These were the debates that were going on whenever the Constitutional Convention going on. You want to read what each side had. Understand that not all the founding fathers agreed. They had different points of view, and they were all coming together voluntarily to try to organize a society where they all compromised in order for their common good. You also want to look at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Again, another resource on the debates. It's a great place to look and see, who was saying what were they actually debating, what were their different perspectives, what were they afraid might happen, why did they make this compromise here, those type of things. You'll get a much clearer picture of why things actually got structured the way they did in our Constitution. James Madison's essay on property, very good for understanding property rights. Definitely one everyone should read. While not one of the founding fathers or anything, Frederick Bastiat on the law, I think that's an excellent resource for people being able to actually understand the role between a just government and an unjust government, and how a government can actually be voluntary and actually be there to protect people's rights. I think it's a very interesting thing to be able to look at. Another great book is Colored Patriots of the American Revolution by William Cooper Nell. For those of you who don't know, William Cooper Nell was an associate of Frederick Douglass and worked with him at his newspaper as an abolitionist in order to help bring about the ending of slavery. But he wrote this book, Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, where he went through and told the stories of different colored patriots that actually, fought in the American Revolution, believed in the cause, that they had it, and that it really gets rid of the idea that we're traditionally taught about the founding fathers and the history of slavery early in America. And I wanted to get in that day, but there was just no way I had time to cover that subject, because it could just be a whole presentation itself. But this is a very good book. So that's going to wrap this presentation up, guys. I hope you enjoyed it very much. I hope it was useful for you, and that you could take this information and then do some further research and maybe be able to consider some things you didn't before. If you had dismissed the founding fathers or never really looked into their work, maybe I hope this piques your interest enough to at least be able to go study and see, what can we learn from them. Where did they succeed and where did they fail, and how can we take those lessons forward in our current time and in our context, so we can create a society where all of our liberty is intact. So again, guys, thank you for watching. Thanks again to all the organizers at the conference for putting on, such an amazing conference and bringing so many different speakers on such a variety of subjects together. I absolutely think that's what we need. We need as much knowledge on as many different subjects as we can possibly get. For those of you who are going to be, looking for more of my work in the future, as wintertime comes up and my farm slows down, more work will be coming out on my Eye of the Storm astrology channel with Vedic astrology, Vedic philosophy in general, as well as, I've been doing a lot of research into, early constitutional law, how to help people protect themselves in court, how to set up private membership associations or PMAs so people can then operate outside of government jurisdiction and not have to worry about the harassment. For those who may not know, the farm my wife and I operate, we operate an unincorporated ministry, which keeps our land and our farm and everything protected, so we can operate outside that government jurisdiction. If people are interested, I don't have a lot of time to go into that, but if people are interested in those type of things or want to see more videos on that, you can send me an email at libertyhavenministry@protonmail.com. You guys can also, again, find me on the One Great Work Network, and I hope you guys, as well as on my Eye of the Storm astrology channel. So keep an eye out for all those things. Again, I hope everybody enjoyed it, and have a great day.